Okay, to everybody out there who is watching this as a stream clip, this is currently happening in a members only stream. So the only people in here with me, like Steffi, Chrissy, Glabine, Matt, Kratost, Tim, Bryn, Pretty I8, I can sort of say it, Nathaniel, Christian, Joaquim, all of these guys, they're here because they're members. So if you want to hang out with us live during these special streams, consider becoming a member. It'd be super cool. Anyway, what we're talking about today is this new article that just dropped from the one and only illustrious Jason Schreier. He put this out, and basically he did an investigation into the development of Redfall to figure out what happened. And this is one of my favorite things that Jason Schreier has been doing recently. It's almost like an autopsy, you know, where he just goes into this thing that's dead or that is really screwed up, and then he breaks it down and tries to figure out what the hell happened. What is this? And I find it fascinating. He talks to developers, to executives, to marketing people, to coders and programmers. He talks to everybody and finds out some really interesting stuff. And I want to go through it and break it down. So what it starts off with is, over the years, Microsoft Corp-owned video game developer Arcane Studios has cultivated a reputation for releasing games that are beloved by fans, yet don't sell very well, such as Prey and Dishonored 2. By contrast, the studio's most recent game, Redfall, has achieved something new. It has managed to be at once a commercial and critical flop. Or disappointment. I prefer the word flop. And it's true. They somehow managed to do both. They figured it out the wrong way. They wanted both yes, but they got both no. Basically, what we're going to learn over the course of this article, just for those that might want to pop out early, is that this was a game that was built or ideated around the same time as Fallout 76. And as a result, it was built from the ground up to be pumped full of monetization, to be just crammed with microtransactions, cosmetics, gun upgrades, and XP boosts, all of that stuff. And then after the Microsoft acquisition, they sort of reevaluated and went, okay, well, do we actually still need this to be so pumped full, or are we good now? And this is actually how I predicted that ZeniMax was going to sell to Microsoft, because games like Fallout 76 just didn't make sense. The management hadn't changed, and yet all of a sudden they were super, super greedy out of nowhere, right? And so I was like, something's changed. If the management hasn't changed, then management's motivations have changed, which means they're probably planning on selling or going public. In this case, selling looked more likely because there were other people investigating, giving them an offer. However, Redfall seems to have been part of that Fallout 76 group of games, and it was being built to try and milk players for more money. And over the course of its development, they lost a ton of talent, which is going to be sort of the story of this article, is that a lot of the people that worked on Prey, for example, left the studio during the development of Redfall because they came in, they saw this was going on, and they weren't about it. And so they jumped ship, went to a different studio, which does happen a lot. There was the example of The Witcher 3, which lost a ton of developers after it launched, where a bunch of those people left and stopped working on Cyberpunk, went and worked for other studios, founded their own studios. There was just a studio announced, like, I think yesterday, former Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk devs who are starting their own team. So this type of thing is normal, but not the crazy exodus of talent that happened in the case of Redfall. So it's going to be pretty interesting. So right here, it seems there is an issue with every element of the game, he says. This is Tariq Musa. I'm not sure who he writes for, but okay. In the end, Redfall feels unpolished, underdone, underwhelming, and uncomfortable, which I'd say is very apt as a description of it. The high-profile dud extends the pain this year for Microsoft's Xbox division, which has struggled to produce hits and watched as its planned $69 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard Inc. has gotten tripped up by US and UK regulators. Interestingly, though, Activision Blizzard's stock has actually been making a bit of a climb in recent weeks, which is indicative of one of two things. Either investors think that it is actually worth more than it's currently valued at, so it's actually closer to the offered purchase price, which means that it's not that Microsoft's even getting that great of a deal on it, because they're offering, my understanding is $90 a share. It's already climbing back up to 80, and it's on its way further and further up after dropping down to like 73, 74 after the news of the UK regulators blocking it came out. So that's interesting. Nonetheless, that's very interesting. But what they went on to say is Just van Drunen, maybe Just, I'm not sure, a video game analyst and professor, said Redfall's failure highlights the significant gap between Microsoft's lofty aspirations and actual projects, which also calls into question Microsoft's ability to establish long-term franchises on its own strength rather than buying them outright. And I totally agree. There is a real issue with Microsoft and getting games out the door that are high quality, that are decently polished. Like, it's just not really a thing for them right now. It's amazing, but they're trying to come in and like buy stuff and I guess cut corners that way, but that's not how you do it. You got to be able to make your own stuff too and get that across the finish line. One of the other interesting things they mention is the interview that Phil Spencer did with Kinda Funny Games. We talked about this on stream, where he said that Redfall's review scores were significantly lower than our internal metrics. Basically, they had done internal reviews where they had maybe game devs or maybe executives or marketing people or just random Joe Schmoes review the game, Redfall, and like give it a score, see what they thought the game would score at. And it apparently internally scored way higher than what eventually happened, which was high 50s when all was said and done. Apparently right now on Metacritic, the average is about 54 out of 100 for Redfall. So this was, I think they said double digits lower than they expected. And when he did this interview, it was still in the 60s for Metacritic. So apparently they expected it to land like in the 7 out of 10 range, which still is not great, but it's a lot better than 54 out of 100, I'll tell you what. However, this is where it gets interesting. To the makers of Redfall, the mediocre reception was no big surprise. The project suffered from unclear direction, frequent attrition, and perennial lack of staff, according to more than a dozen people who worked on the game, speaking anonymously because they were not authorized to discuss it publicly. A spokesperson for Redfall's publisher, Bethesda Softworks, declined to comment. Shocker. They they didn't feel like chatting with this one. So basically what he goes into is he begins to describe some of the inner workings of what happened. Development of Redfall began in 2018. At the time, ZeniMax, the large privately held owner of BGS and Arcane and id and all of these other companies, they were looking to sell itself. Behind the scene, the company was encouraging its studios to develop games that could generate revenue beyond initial sales, a popular trend dubbed games as a service, which was taking off in the 2010s thanks to lucrative hits like Overwatch and Fortnite. And this is something even Sony's doing now. I mean, they're starting to really try to shift and move into this realm where the games they put out start generating revenue over the long term. Instead of just $70 once, they get $70 and then $30 for like a skin, and then they get you to buy a gun skin for $10, and then they got a new season pass. I'll buy the season pass for another $20-25. All of a sudden, you've doubled the amount of money you've spent on this one game, and all they had to do was develop the game and then put together some cheap cosmetics that are super easy to toss together. So this is not at all surprising. Interestingly, he notes that development on Redfall began in 2018. 2018 is the same year that Fallout 76 launched. So they were finishing Fallout 76 and then they started Redfall, which I know like it's very staggered, but presumably they were anticipating on trying to build out this long-term money printing machine of live service games before they were acquired by Xbox. And they weren't even necessarily sold that they were going to be sold. They weren't sure they were going to be sold to Xbox necessarily. They might have been sold to another company like a Vivendi or somebody who would want them to keep pumping out live service games. So it's not like they were just trying to go forward with Fallout 76 as the only live service game. So according to people familiar with the process, ZeniMax was strongly urging developers and at its subsidiaries to implement microtransactions, that is, recurring opportunities within games for players to spend real money, say outfitting their characters. Although this wasn't an absolute mandate, several ZeniMax franchises such as Fallout, Doom, and Wolfenstein would soon release versions or new versions incorporating online multiplayer and monetization options. I would love to know how that worked out, if it did. Like, I would love to know if Fallout 76 has actually been making money, because they have, like, that thing is monetized out the ass. But I would love to know. I would love to know if it's actually making money. Exactly. They needed some proud skeptics. By the way, guys, LukeStevensTV.com. We have a new, this one's really funny. Inspired by Colt when we reacted to one of his videos. Hype makes you stupid. If you're interested, check it out. And when you buy it, I will send you a little personalized thank you video. I have a bunch of those I need to do. I'm a little behind. At Arcane's headquarters in Austin, Harvey Smith and Ricardo Barre, probably just Bear, respected industry veterans, were tapped to serve as co-directors of Redfall. Following the commercially unsuccessful release of sci-fi shooter Prey earlier, leadership across the company wanted to make something with more broad appeal, mass market appeal, which, by the way, is a little bit of a bummer that Prey was such, like, it was considered a failure financially. That's too bad, because the game was crazy. It was very good. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say amazing, but it was very good, and the DLC seems to be very, very good as well. It definitely was very unique, but I think it was really hard for them to describe what Prey was in an concise way without getting into spoilers and stuff. Because, if you've played Prey, I won't get into it, but if you've played Prey, describing it almost spoils it. Your best bet is to go into it straight, fresh, nothing else. It's just, man. What eventually emerged was the idea to make a multiplayer game in which users would team up to battle vampires and perhaps pay for occasional cosmetic upgrades. Shocker. Since its founding, they get into discussions of the tension. And this is what is, I think, the biggest problem with these big companies trying to ham-fist monetization into these games, and specifically from these studios. A team like Arcane is known for really high-quality single-player games. People always say oh, well, if you force a team that's really known for single-player, did I say multiplayer? I meant single-player. Single-player games. And then you force them to make multiplayer games, the audience isn't going to like it. They just won't. They're not going to like it. They won't respond well. And you're going to have a bad time. A lot of the fans will get frustrated and potentially even just leave. One thing that I hadn't really thought about that he's going to get into is that you also will lose a ton of the talent. Because the developers specialize in single player games. They're not multiplayer developers. They don't like developing games that are just built to print cash by getting people to buy cosmetics. They don't enjoy that. So they move to other teams. And I think we've seen that with Rocksteady, with the Suicide Squad game. I think we're seeing it with, of course, Redfall and Arcane. We saw it with Fallout 76 and Bethesda Game Studios Austin. I don't remember what it was called before BGS bought it, but they lost a bunch of talent. And this is just a story told again and again and again, where whenever one of these studios that's world renowned for single player stuff gets into the multiplayer space, they lose a lot of talent. And it's just too bad. And it ultimately really, really hurts the game as a result. It doesn't work. Amazingly, if you're a company and you lose your best employees and your talent, doesn't work. It's weird. You start to have a bit of time. It's weird. Developers under Smith and Barre said the two leads were outwardly excited, but as the project progressed, failed to provide clear direction. Staff members said that over time they grew frustrated with management's frequently shifting references to other games, such as Far Cry and Borderlands, that left each department with varying ideas of what exactly they were making. Throughout the development, the fundamental tension between single-player and multiplayer game design remained unresolved. Smith and Beret did not respond to requests for comment. This is another problem with this whole like upper managers trying to force you to make a multiplayer game. There's a problem in like the tech space right now where Apple is making a headset. This is going to be announced very, very shortly. So if you're watching this like after June 5th, this has already been announced. But Apple is working on a VR headset. And this VR headset, allegedly, according to leaks, is going to be roughly $3,000. It's going to require a separate like man purse on the side for the battery because they didn't want to have the battery built into the headset. It's like an AR headset thing. It's going to be, who knows like what the deal is, but you can see here, like they have done renders where it has a satchel on the side that's wired to it. And so presumably somebody is just going to be sitting at a coffee shop with this thing on. It's insane to me. I don't know why anybody would buy this, but the reason I bring this up is because this is a product. This is a solution in search of a problem. They decided, sorry, it's a satchel. You're right. Pretty. It's not a purse. It's a satchel. It's an attaché. So they designed this because they wanted to get into VR and whatever metaverse stuff that they wanted to do. But they failed to really consider, wait, does anybody actually want this? Like, is anybody going to actually buy this thing? What are the actual odds? And frankly, other than like the hardest core of Apple fanboys, I can't imagine that many people are going to buy that. Like $3,000, even if in second gen, they cut it to $1,500 or $1,000, because there's no way that they ever sell this thing for less than $1,000. It's Apple. I mean, come on. I don't see anybody buying this. Like, I just don't. Unless they show some insane software, I just don't know why you would do it. I could see myself buying it for a day and a half and then realizing I would have no use for it and then returning it. And I think that's where a lot of people were going to end up. But this is exactly what these multiplayer games turn into, is that people buy these things and don't really know, or rather they started development on this product, and they weren't really sure why they were making it other than that they thought it could potentially make a bunch of money. And then they have this thing now, this headset, which is cool, but like, what do you do with it? It's not clear because there's no consistency in the vision or anything. It's not like they thought, oh, well, we want to fix the problem of people having little screens. So this headset's going to give you access to an array of screens all around you, and it'll be amazing. Like, if that's your goal, okay, interesting. I don't know how many people are actually going to consider like a $3,000 headset affixed to that, but whatever. And then with these multiplayer games, it's just like, I don't know, just make a multiplayer game that makes money. Like, well, but do we have a vision to be like this amazing vampire game with a dark and gritty story? Do we want to have it be a little bit more goofy? Do we want to have this be like the ultimate co-op game, no single player? Like, how are we doing this? I don't care. Do Borderlands mixed with Far Cry, mixed with Overwatch, and just figure it out. Like, there's no concern for what the vision actually is, because there is no vision. It's just try to do something like these other things that make money. And when that's the extent of your creative vision, it's obviously not going to end up well. I'm sorry. I know that was a diatribe and that was a little bit of a tangent, but hopefully it made some modicum of sense. Oh yeah, don't forget about the student loan struggles. Yeah, that's the other thing, is it's like they think that just having characters with student loans makes them super relatable, which I guess on paper they are, because we have that in common. I have student loans, they have student loans, but I play video games to not think about that, and frankly it's super cringe when somebody defines themselves that way. He went on to say that Arcane was also perpetually understaffed, said people familiar with its production. The studio's Austin office employed less than 100 people, sufficient for a relatively small single-player game like Prey, but not enough to complete a multiplayer behemoth akin to something like Fortnite or Destiny, which are developed by teams of hundreds or thousands. I think Fortnite is probably thousands. Even additional support from ZeniMax's Wisconsin-based Roundhouse studio and other outsourcing houses couldn't fill in the gaps, they said. Morale at Arcane suffered. Veteran workers who weren't interested in developing a multiplayer game left in droves. By the end of Redfall's development, roughly 70% of the Austin staff who had worked on Prey would no longer be at the company. 70% of them left. Wow. According to people familiar, as well as a Bloomberg analysis of LinkedIn and Prey's credits. That's wild. That's wild. People often say fans will be upset if this single player studio starts developing multiplayer stuff. But you gotta also remember that the devs don't want to spend 5 years of their lives making something they don't like. And so they'll move to a studio that lets them do something they're passionate about, especially if the last game they worked on was Prey and was received well. You know, why would they stay and work on this game that nobody wants to make? So they go on. Filling vacancies became a challenge. Within the industry, ZeniMax had a reputation for paying lower than average salaries, and convincing some progressive or moderate video game developers to move to Texas could be difficult due to the state's conservative social policies. I will say, though, I was just in Austin like a few weeks ago, month ago. I guess it's June 1st, like a month and a couple weeks ago. And Austin is like the Boulder of the South. Austin is very liberal, but Texas as a state is very, very conservative and very red. But Austin is very blue for sure. Since Redfall wasn't yet announced, the studio couldn't describe its details to prospective employees, a predicament that exacerbated the staffing issues, sources familiar with the process said. Arcane wanted to hire recruits with experience on multiplayer shooters, but the people who applied were by and large looking to work on a single-player immersive sim. I mean, it makes sense because they're going and applying to Austin, or to Arcane Austin, who makes those types of games. So when they probably were interviewing and joined up, they were like, wait, what kind of game are we making? What? Kind of disappointed. Meanwhile, on September 21st of 2020, Microsoft purchased ZeniMax for $7.5 billion. It was an ambitious move that gave Xbox control over lucrative franchises such as Doom and Fallout, as well as the upcoming Starfield, blah, blah, blah. Although adding Arcane's portfolio wasn't the main goal, it was potentially a nice bonus for Microsoft, particularly if Redfall turned into a hit. Big if there. The acquisition gave some staff at Arcane hope that Microsoft might cancel Redfall, or better yet, let them reboot it as a single-player game, according to sources familiar with the production. Instead, Microsoft maintained a hands-off approach. Aside from canceling a version of Redfall that had been planned for rival Sony Corp's PlayStation, Microsoft allowed ZeniMax to continue operating as it had before with great autonomy. Microsoft's Phil Spencer would later say in the Kinda Funny interview that Xbox didn't do a good job early in engaging with Arcane Austin. This is the other thing that Microsoft, I think, has to figure out is how much they want to get involved. Because as far as we can tell, for most of these games, they have maintained very hands-off approaches where they are like, yeah, we just bought you, but you keep doing what you're doing. You're doing great. Pats on the head. Pat. And that just doesn't work because if the game is not received well, it looks bad for Xbox. And I think that that's something they just frankly did not realize. Like, I don't know how they possibly did not see that, but apparently Microsoft's executives just thought, well, if Redfall flops, it's not that big of a deal. It's a ZeniMax game. People will be upset with them, but not with us. But that was a big miscalculation, you know? I agree, Imperium in chat. I get the feeling that post Redfall, they are going to be more hands-on. Yeah, if you watch this interview that they've referenced with Phil Spencer and Kinda Funny Games, he makes it very clear that they are getting more involved. He even said, like, well, with Starfield, that's an example of a game that was much earlier on in production when we joined and bought them. So we're going to be very, very engaged, and we've been helping them and working with them. So he was trying to pretty much from the start be like, yeah, no, we've been involved with Starfield, so don't worry about that one. It's going to be great. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, but definitely all eyes are on Starfield for sure. They go on. Still, expectations remained high. During a 2021 press conference, Xbox positioned the Bloody Vampire Extravaganza as one of the company's big upcoming releases, dramatically revealing it as the event's show-stopping finale. Yet, during the final frantic months, the remaining Arcane staff found themselves stretched thin, and the debut date was pushed back from Halloween of 22 to early 23, and then eventually May of 23. Along the way, Smith and other leaders assured staff that the game would get exponentially better once the final art was implemented and the bugs were fixed, promising that, quote, Arcane magic would manifest at the last minute as it had with previous games. Other devs, such as EA's BioWare, had been widely criticized for using similar language. Yeah, this is like apparently the same thing exactly that happened with Cyberpunk 2077. If you guys remember the articles that went up after that game's floppy launch, they said, well, yeah, it's not working right now, but we're going to figure it out. We made The Witcher 3 after all. And that's how they justified it constantly. They just kept being like, we made The Witcher 3, so we'll figure it out, right? What could possibly go wrong? It's not like we're going to launch it broken. We made The Witcher 3, you know? And when you have to start doing that and coping to that extent, there's problems. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with Anthem. Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. And that's what he's referencing with this EA BioWare thing, who just constantly were like, oh, it'll come together at the last minute. Totally, for sure. And then sure didn't. In the end, Redfall never coalesced. Several people who played the game in 2021 were shocked to see how little ultimately changed. The final glitchy product felt to some critics like a poor compromise between single-player and multiplayer ideas that failed to please fans of either type of game. Yeah. It was a jack of all trades, master of none, but it wasn't even a jack of all trades. It was like a four of clubs. And that's a four of clubs of all trades. Just didn't work. Harvey Smith recently said in an interview with the website Eurogamer that, quote, early on, he pushed back against the compulsory inclusion of an in-game store, but people who worked on the game said the remarks didn't square with how things played out. For the first 3 years, so from 2018 to 2021, presumably, Redfall had significant microtransaction plans in place. Only in 2021, with games as a service growing more controversial among gamers, did Arcane finally scrap its unwieldy in-game monetization plans. Dude, I would love to see what they cut, because they still had plans for different playable characters coming after launch. And so, man, it would be fascinating to know just how aggressive the monetization was planned to be. Like, I wonder if they even had loot boxes and crap like that. I don't know, man. That would have been fascinating to see. I wonder what could have actually been done to make Redfall more fun. It seems like at its core, it just wasn't a fun gaming experience. I think simply, like, the reason it felt so generic is because there wasn't a lot of variety with the weaponry. AI was extremely lackluster. Combat in general is extremely easy. It also seems that they were relying a lot on the different like play styles and different abilities of the different characters in co-op to add more versatility and variability, but it just didn't come together. Like, a lot of people still played it as a single player game, and those who played it in co-op were like, yeah, it's interesting, the abilities are pretty similar, but I guess it's more interesting than just single player. But it never really came together. You know, there just wasn't anything that really made this stand out. And the easy thing that Arcane is really good at is level design. They are so good at it, except now they've lost most of their talent in that regard. And that completely went out the window when they decided to have this like sort of open world generic co-op adventure game. It just didn't work. Recently, Microsoft has said that Arcane will continue to work to improve Redfall, but its rough launch only raises the pressure for the rest of the ZeniMax lineup, particularly Starfield, which is scheduled to arrive in September. In the interim, the industry will be watching to see what lessons, if any, Microsoft has learned. Quote, the disappointment of Redfall evidences Microsoft's desperate need for attractive content if it is indeed going to beat rivals Sony and Nintendo at their own game, analyst Van Drunen said. My hope is that it will inoculate Xbox from repeating a similar mistake in the future. I mean, I hope they've learned this lesson too. Time will tell, because they had a handful of kind of questionable launches. I think they got a taste of what success could feel like with Hi-Fi Rush, which Shadow dropped out of nowhere, was very well received. People loved it. And I think they were like riding high off of that. They're like, yeah, we could do this. This Game Pass thing could really work. If we get some games that people love and that go viral, that we just drop and come out and are awesome, I mean, we'll be there. That'll be great. But instead, they had Hi-Fi Rush and then they came out with Redfall. And you just can't do that. You need more consistency. At the very least, like, they should have Xbox studios or like PlayStation studios. They should have the publishing arm that handles their premier studios. And then they have maybe the underlings, the second tier. So, you know, you have Ninja Theory in that top category. You have probably BGS in the top category. You have whatever they're called that do Forza and are doing Fable. Those guys, or Need for Speed, I don't know, whoever is doing Fable. You have all those companies in your premier Xbox publisher category. So when people see, oh, this is an Xbox Studios game, they get excited. Right now you hear Xbox Studios and you're like, oh, so is it going to be like a knockoff of Wii Sports for the Kinect? Like, that's what I think of when I think of Xbox Studios. I think of like early 2013, 2014 crappy Kinect games. And they got to rework that. That's a problem. Like, I kind of live and breathe video games, and the fact that the first thing I think of when I think of Xbox Studios are those old Kinect games, that's a real problem. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what Arcane does after this, what Microsoft has learned, if they're going to be more involved. And I mean, the other piece of this too is it's easy for us to look at the story of Redfall and be like, yeah, Microsoft should have been more involved. But that's assuming that Microsoft's involvement would have helped. It's possible Microsoft getting more involved could have just made it worse. You never know. You know, the story of a lot of these companies that come in and just throw money at stuff is that you can get access to a publisher, access to a developer, or to their game that they're working on. You can buy publishing rights, whatever. But it's more complicated than that. It just is. Throwing money does not fix some of these foundational issues, especially in terms of video game development, which is an artistic, nuanced, complicated, years-long process that's extremely arduous. Money doesn't just make it work. You know, it takes a lot of skill, a lot of know-how, and you also, the biggest thing is you have to be able to identify what games the industry will be into 5 years ahead of time. Think about what games were coming out 5 years ago. We had Monster Hunter World. We had AC Odyssey, God of War, Red Dead 2, Smash Bros. Ultimate, Celeste. I mean, honestly, 2018 was a great year. Like, Jesus Christ. Wow. Yeah, that was a very good year. Sea of Thieves. I think of Sea of Thieves and I think of something that's been out for like a decade. I can't believe that it's only 2018, but still. It's just 5 years ago is when these games started development. And in 2018, I mean, if we go maybe to 2017 was also the year that we got games like Battlefront 2. And this was the age of like giga microtransactions, of these loot boxes everywhere. Shadow of War, which was just crammed with that stuff. And then over the course of 5 years, things kind of settled down. But if you were making decisions as to what kind of games you wanted to make 5-6 years in the future, back in 2017, if you're a business, like a bigwig suit and tie kind of man sitting in an office somewhere, you'd be like, oh, we'll just make our own loot box game. We'll just cram it full. That's the same thing. Like, I still think we're going to see some NFT games and stuff come out in the next few years, because during the middle of the craze of NFTs, they greenlit a bunch of these games from venture capitalists who don't know anything about gaming, and they're going to have to get it out. So we're probably going to see a handful of really cringy NFT projects coming down the road that people will see and be like, what the hell is this? Why did anybody greenlight this? And it'll be because of all of this crap. He took my thing. Red flag, red flag.